They called her our wife. Two words that sounded like belonging but felt like ownership, the kind assigned to property rather than people. She had been his wife on paper, but in that house she was inventory. She set the table for dinners where they debated her womb. She ironed shirts for a man who was ironing out plans to replace her. She smiled at a mother-in-law who smiled back, while quietly building a case against her. Barren, broken, a burden to the bloodline. But every night, when the house settled into its comfortable cruelty, she opened her Bible to Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. And she held on to it the way a drowning woman holds on to the one rope she absolutely trusts. She needed that rope the morning he married a millionaire. Not just any millionaire, a woman of headline and influence, a woman who worked for the trillion-dollar company, the kind of company that has a seat at every global table, that moves markets with press releases, that makes and breaks careers with a single board decision. She was luminous. She was connected. She was, by every visible measure, everything his family had prayed he would find. But she worked in the building. His wife built the building. Every floor, every deal, every dazzling title the mistress held had been made possible by a woman they called our wife and treated like help. The trillion-dollar empire that had made the mistress's career, her reputation, her millionaire status, had been quietly, brilliantly, secretly constructed by the woman they had just served with divorce papers. The grounds, barrenness. The morning everything changed, she was standing in her own kitchen, the kitchen she had renovated with her own private account, in the house registered in her name, and she was holding those divorce papers. She stared at the word on the legal document, Baren, and somewhere inside her, beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation, beneath 7 years of a love she had given fully to a man who had spent it carelessly, something almost laughed, because at that very moment she was 10 weeks pregnant with triplets. 3 heartbeats, 3 destinies, 3 answers to prayers she had wept into her pillow on nights he did not come home. God had heard every single one, and now came the part of the story no one predicted. Not the husband, not the mistress, not the lawyers, not the family that had quietly agreed she was disposable. His mother found out first. And what she did, the woman who had planted the word barren into her son's mind like a seed of rejection, shocked the wife into silence. And then, with the full truth in her hands, with 3 lives growing inside her, with a trillion-dollar company waiting for her signature, and with a faith that had never once let her down, what the wife did next brought every single one of them to tears. Was it the tears of a family that finally saw what they had thrown away? Or the tears of a woman who finally let herself cry for the right reasons? And when it was over, when justice and mercy stood in the same room, what did God's faithfulness look like in flesh and blood? Stay, because this story does not end the way you think it does, and the ending will change how you see everything. What you are about to watch is more than a story. It is a mirror. It will show you what happens when a woman of faith is pushed beyond her limits and chooses to trust God anyway. You will learn that what is hidden in you cannot be taken from you, and that the God who sees in secret always rewards openly. Watch every scene closely. When it ends, drop in the comments, what lesson did this story leave in your heart? And what would you have done differently in her place? Subscribe now, because stories that build your faith and shift your perspective are what we do here. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday, not slipped under a door, not mailed with the quiet cowardice of a man who could not face what he was doing. They were hand-delivered by a lawyer in a charcoal suit who rang the doorbell at 8:47 in the morning while Eleanor Hayes was still in her kitchen, still in her robe, still holding the mug of chamomile tea she made every morning before she opened her Bible. She opened the door. She read the man's face before she read the document, and then she read the document. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Grounds, inability to bear children, irreconcilable barrenness. Eleanor did not cry. Not immediately. She had learned over 7 years in the Hayes household to process pain the way a river processes rock, slowly, quietly, and with a patience that looked, from the outside, like stillness. Sorry, but inside she was breaking along fault lines that had been forming for years. Long before this morning, Long before the courthouse wedding she had heard about from a church sister's phone screen 3 weeks ago. Long before Raymond Hayes had stopped seeing her as a woman and started seeing her as a problem he needed to solve. She set the papers on the kitchen counter. Her kitchen counter, in a kitchen she had redesigned 2 years ago using funds from an account Raymond did not know existed. And she pressed both palms flat against the marble. Cold, solid, real. In all things, she whispered, in all things, God works for the good. She had been 17 the first time she read Romans 8:28. Sitting in the back pew of her grandmother's church in Georgia, wearing shoes that were too tight and a dress that had been let out twice, while she had read that verse and felt something settle inside her. A deep, unshakable conviction that God was not absent from the painful parts of life. He was most present in them. That conviction had carried her through her mother's death at 19, through the collapse of her first business attempt at 22, through the slow, grinding loneliness of a marriage that had started with warmth and gradually cooled into function. And it was carrying her now, at 34, standing in her kitchen on a Thursday morning, holding proof that the man she had loved with her whole God-fearing heart had legally declared her worthless. But Eleanor Hayes had a secret. She had several, actually. But the one that mattered most, the one that would eventually reorder every power structure in that family, was the one growing inside her. And 10 weeks along, 3 heartbeats confirmed by a private obstetrician who had been sworn to confidentiality, who had shown her the ultrasound image with wide eyes and a low whistle, who had said, "Mrs. Hayes, you are carrying triplets," and then waited for her to either faint or shout. She had done neither. She had folded her hands in her lap, looked at the 3 tiny flickers on the screen, and said quietly, "Thank you, Lord." Because she had prayed for a child for 6 years. 6 years of temperature charts and specialist appointments, in herbal teas, in fervent, tear-soaked prayers, while Raymond slept soundly beside her, unbothered. 6 years of his mother, Dorothy Hayes, appearing at Sunday dinners with that particular smile, the one that was shaped like sympathy but functioned like a verdict, saying things like, Some women just aren't built for it, dear," while refilling her own glass. 6 years, and God had answered with 3, but the answer had come 10 weeks ago, quietly, privately, in the body of a woman whose husband had already stopped looking at her long enough to notice. And Eleanor, guided by a discernment she had learned to trust completely, had told no one. Not her doctor's sister in Atlanta, not her best friend from college, not the God sisters at her church who would have rejoiced loudly and prematurely. She had kept it the way she kept everything precious, hidden, covered, protected by prayer and by wisdom. Now she stood in her kitchen with divorce papers on one side of her and 3 unborn lives on the other. And she understood with perfect clarity that she was standing at the edge of something enormous. A turning point so significant that she could almost feel the narrative of her life shifting beneath her feet. The way the earth shifts before a fault line releases everything it has been holding. Raymond was at that moment, she knew, in a downtown hotel suite with Vanessa Cole, the millionaire, the celebrated, the woman whose name appeared in financial magazines, whose face was on the company website of Apex Global Enterprises, the trillion-dollar conglomerate that had restructured 3 industries in the last decade and was currently valued at $1.4 trillion. Vanessa Cole, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development at Apex Global. Vanessa Cole, who had built her entire career, her reputation, her net worth, her identity, inside a company that Eleanor Hayes had founded, funded, and quietly continued to own through a series of holding companies and legal structures so carefully constructed that not even the company's own executive board knew the name of their ultimate shareholder. Eleanor picked up the divorce papers again. She read them once more slowly, the way she read scripture, looking not just at the words, but at what the words revealed about the person who had chosen them. Baren. She placed her right hand over her abdomen, gently, deliberately, and she felt, or imagined she felt, the faintest flutter of something alive. "Fear not," she said softly to herself, to the 3 lives inside her, to the God she had never stopped trusting even when he was silent. "For I am with you, I will strengthen you, I will help you." Isaiah 41:10. She was still standing there, still breathing, was still anchored when she heard the front door open. And the footsteps that followed were not Raymond's. They were heavier, more deliberate, accompanied by the particular sound of a handbag being set on the hallway table, a sound Eleanor had heard 1,000 times. Dorothy Hayes had let herself in with the key her son had given her years ago. The key Eleanor had never asked to be returned, because she had understood, even then, that some battles are not won by fighting. They are won by waiting. Dorothy appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was a tall woman, composed, silver-haired, dressed even at this hour as though she expected to be photographed. But something in her face this morning was different. Something had shifted behind those carefully maintained eyes. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the papers on the counter. And for the first time in 7 years, Dorothy Hayes did not smile. What did Dorothy know? What had brought her here, at this exact moment, on this exact morning? And why, for the first time in 7 years, was the woman who had never once looked at Eleanor with anything but polite condescension, now looking at her with something that looked terrifyingly close to guilt? Dorothy Hayes did not sit down immediately. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. In 7 years of unannounced kitchen visits, Dorothy had always moved through Eleanor's home with the casual ownership of a woman who considered herself the true authority of any space her son occupied. She would sit, she would pour her own coffee, she would rearrange things on the counter with small, deliberate adjustments that were never about tidiness. They were about dominance. But this morning, Dorothy stood in the doorway, and she held on to the doorframe the way a person holds on to something fixed when the ground beneath them is no longer reliable. "Eleanor," she said, "just the name, nothing attached to it." Eleanor turned fully to face her. She did not reach for the divorce papers. She did not hide them either. She simply stood, still, composed, well rooted in something Dorothy could not name and had never understood about her daughter-in-law. And she waited. Dorothy's eyes moved to the papers, stayed there, then moved back to Eleanor's face. "He told me last night," Dorothy said. Her voice was lower than usual, stripped of its usual social polish. "About the divorce, about Vanessa." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And you came here." "I came here," Dorothy repeated, as though she herself was still processing why. What Eleanor did not know, what she could not have known, was that Dorothy Hayes had not slept, not a single hour. She had sat in the armchair by her bedroom window from midnight until 6 in the morning, holding her phone, staring at a document her youngest daughter Miriam had sent her at 11:45 the previous night, with a message that read, "Mama, before you celebrate Raymond's new marriage, you need to see this. I'm serious. Sit down first." The document was a business registry filing, public record, buried under 3 layers of holding company names: Covenant Capital LLC, Hearthstone Global Partners, Crown Inheritance Trust. But Miriam, who was a corporate attorney in Washington, D.C., had followed the trail with the methodical patience of someone who suspected she would not like what she found at the end of it. She had been right. Crown Inheritance Trust, the ultimate parent entity of Apex Global Enterprises, the trillion-dollar company that employed Vanessa Cole as senior vice president, was registered to a single beneficial owner, Eleanor Grace Hayes. Miriam's message had continued. "The woman Raymond just divorced for being Baren owns the entire company his new wife works for. Every promotion Vanessa Cole ever received, every contract, every dollar of her net worth, all of it exists because Eleanor allowed it to." "Mama, what has Raymond done?" Dorothy had read that message 14 times between midnight and 6 in the morning, and with each reading, the architecture of the life she had built, the assumptions, the verdicts, the carefully maintained hierarchy in which her son was ascending, and his first wife was merely a footnote, had crumbled a little further. But to understand Dorothy's silence that morning, you have to go back further. Much further. You have to go back 11 years, to a conference room on the 32nd floor of a building in Manhattan, where a 23-year-old Eleanor Grace, then Eleanor Grace Whitfield, stood before 7 skeptical investors in a charcoal blazer she had borrowed from her college roommate, and pitched a business model that every single person in that room privately believed would fail within 18 months. She had called it Apex, because she believed, with the unshakable certainty of a young woman who had read Jeremiah 29:11 so many times it had become cellular. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, that she was building something that would reach the top of whatever industry it entered. The investors had funded her, not because they believed in her vision, but because one of them, a quietly brilliant venture capitalist named George Whitmore, he had seen something in her eyes during the Q&A that he later described to his wife as the look of someone who already knows the outcome and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She had been right. Apex Global had not failed in 18 months. It had restructured its first industry in 36 months and its second in 4 years. By the time Eleanor was 29, Apex Global was valued at $200 billion and growing with a momentum that made financial analysts reach for language they did not normally use in quarterly reports. But Eleanor, guided by the same discernment that now kept her pregnancy private and her pain dignified, had restructured her ownership quietly, deliberately, moved it through holding companies, removed her name from visible records, not out of shame, out of wisdom. Because she had learned by then that the most powerful position in any room is the one nobody is looking for. She had also by then met Raymond Hayes. Raymond had been charming in the particular way of men who have never been truly tested. Warm on the surface, shallow underneath, attractive enough that the shallowness took years to fully reveal itself. He had pursued her with a persistence she had mistaken for devotion. He had loved her, she believed, in the beginning, in the way that some people love beautiful things they do not fully understand and therefore cannot properly value. They married when she was 27. She had not told him about Apex, not because she was deceptive, but because she was discerning. She had wanted to be loved as Eleanor, not as the woman who owned a trillion-dollar company. Once she had wanted Raymond to choose her plainly, clearly, without the distortion of wealth and power. He had chosen her, and then gradually he had chosen other things more. Now in the kitchen, Dorothy finally moved. She crossed the room and sat at the table, not with her usual ownership, but with the careful movements of someone who was no longer certain of her welcome. Eleanor, she said again, and this time the name carried weight, carried something that had not been in Dorothy's voice in 7 years. I owe you an apology. Eleanor looked at her, steady, unreadable. I called you Baren, Dorothy said. The words came out like something being pulled from a wound. I said it so many times I stopped hearing how cruel it was. I put that word in Raymond's head. I planted it, and She stopped, pressed her lips together. Miriam showed me something last night. Eleanor waited. She showed me who owns Apex Global. Dorothy's voice dropped to nearly nothing. She showed me it's you, that it has always been you. The kitchen was very quiet. Vanessa Cole, Dorothy continued, and now her voice carried something new. Something that sounded like the dawning of a horror she had not anticipated. Built her entire career inside your company. Everything Raymond thinks she is, everything he left you for, exists because of you. Eleanor set down her chamomile tea. She looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree in the backyard, the one she had planted the first spring of their marriage, pressing the sapling into the earth with her own hands, praying over it quietly, believing it would grow. It had. It was enormous now, unbothered by seasons. Eleanor, Dorothy's voice cracked for the first time. Did you know about Vanessa working about the company? Yes, Eleanor said simply. I knew. Dorothy stared at her. For how long? Eleanor turned from the window, and the look on her face was not anger. It was not triumph. It was something far more complex. The expression of a woman who had carried more than anyone in that family had ever bothered to ask about. Long enough, Eleanor said quietly, to know that God did not need me to intervene. He had his own plan. Dorothy opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes dropped. And that was when she saw it. The way Eleanor's robe fell. The way she was standing. The particular way a woman stands when she is protecting something she carries. Dorothy's eyes went wide. Eleanor. Her voice was barely a whisper now. Are you? But before Eleanor could answer, before the truth that had been growing in secret for 10 weeks could be spoken aloud in that kitchen, Eleanor's phone buzzed on the counter. A news alert from a financial wire service. Breaking. Apex Global Enterprises announces leadership restructuring. Founder and majority shareholder to assume executive chairmanship, effective immediately. Full board statement pending. Dorothy read it from across the counter, read it twice, and then looked up at Eleanor with eyes that were no longer composed, no longer silver-haired and controlled and certain. "That's you," Dorothy whispered. "That's Eleanor. That's you." And downstairs, when in a downtown hotel suite where Raymond Hayes was ordering room service for himself and the woman he believed was his future, his phone was about to ring with a call from the Apex Global Board that would end Vanessa Cole's career, rewrite his understanding of the last 7 years, and introduce him, for the first time, to the real Eleanor Grace Hayes, the woman he had called his wife, the woman he had never actually seen. Raymond was about to learn that the woman he served divorce papers to this morning owned everything his new wife had ever achieved. But what would he do with that knowledge? Would guilt move him? Or would pride harden him further? And what was Vanessa Cole about to discover about the woman whose husband she had taken and whose company had made her everything she was? And Dorothy, sitting in that kitchen, watching Eleanor with new eyes, was her apology enough? Or was it the beginning of something that would cost her far more than words? Raymond Hayes had always believed that confidence was the same thing as power. He had believed it at 17 when he walked into rooms with his shoulders back and his chin up and people moved aside without knowing exactly why. He had believed it at 26 when he married Eleanor Grace Whitfield and felt, standing at that altar, that he was acquiring something rare, something he could not fully name but was certain belonged in his life. He had believed it 3 weeks ago, standing in a courthouse with Vanessa Cole's hand in his, telling himself that this woman, this life, this elevation was what he had always deserved. But confidence, Raymond was about to learn, is only power when the ground beneath it is real. And the ground beneath Raymond Hayes had not been real for a very long time. The call came at 9:23 in the morning. Raymond was sitting at the hotel suite's dining table, still in his dress shirt from the night before, scrolling through congratulatory messages on his phone while Vanessa moved around the suite behind him. Elegant, unhurried, trailing the particular perfume that had first pulled him across a dinner party 3 years ago like a hook through water. He had not thought of Eleanor once this morning. That fact would later become one of the things he could not forgive himself for. Not the divorce, not the second marriage, but the ease of it, the lightness. The way a man could dismantle 7 years of a woman's life and then order Eggs Benedict the next morning without his hand shaking. The call was from Gerald Monroe, chairman of the Apex Global Board of Directors, a man Raymond had met exactly twice, at corporate events Vanessa had brought him to, where he had stood at the edge of important conversations and felt the particular pride of a man who believes proximity to power is the same as possessing it. Raymond Hayes? Gerald Monroe's voice was the voice of a man who delivered bad news the way surgeons deliver diagnoses, cleanly, without cushioning, because cushioning only prolongs the damage. "Speaking," Raymond said, already frowning. "I'm calling as a professional courtesy," Gerald said, "because of your connection to Vanessa Cole. I want you to hear this from a person before you read it in the wire services." Raymond went still. Apex Global's majority shareholder, our founder, who has operated anonymously through a holding structure for the past decade, has elected to step into executive chairmanship effective this morning. This transition has triggered a mandatory review of all senior leadership appointments made in the last 5 years. A pause, precise, calibrated. Ms. Cole's position is among those under immediate review. Raymond's coffee cup was halfway to his mouth. It stayed there. "I'm also authorized to tell you," Gerald continued, "that the shareholder in question has requested that I convey her name to you personally." Another pause. Longer this time, heavy with something Raymond could not yet identify. "The founder and executive chairman of Apex Global Enterprises is Eleanor Grace Hayes." The coffee cup came down. Hard. Coffee spread across the white tablecloth like a stain that would not come out. Behind him, Vanessa stopped moving. "I'm sorry," Raymond said. His voice was strange in his own ears, distant. "Why, could you repeat that name?" "Eleanor Grace Hayes," Gerald Monroe said. I believe she is currently your wife, Mr. Hayes, though I understand that status may be in transition." The precision of that final sentence was surgical. "I'm sorry to be the one to inform you. Good morning." The line went dead. Raymond sat for a long time without moving. The coffee continued its slow spread across the tablecloth. Outside the hotel window, the city moved with its ordinary indifference. Taxis, pedestrians, the indifferent machinery of a world that does not pause for personal collapse. Vanessa came around the table. She had heard enough. The name, the title, the silence that followed. And her face, that carefully constructed face that had graced magazine profiles and industry panels, was doing something Raymond had never seen it do. It was coming apart. "Eleanor Hayes," she said, not a question, a reckoning. "You knew her?" Raymond asked. The question was almost absurd. Vanessa stopped. She sat down across from him slowly, as though her legs had made a decision her mind had not yet authorized. "I knew of the shareholder. Everyone at Apex knew there was a silent majority owner. We were told it was a private trust. We were never given a name." She looked at Raymond, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time without the filter of what he represented to her ambitions. "Eleanor Grace Hayes is your wife." "Was," Raymond said automatically. Then the word landed on him like something physical. Was. He had signed papers to make her was. This morning. In the same morning she had apparently stepped into the chairmanship of the company that had made Vanessa Cole's career possible. The timing was not coincidental. Raymond understood that immediately. Eleanor had not acted impulsively. Eleanor, he was beginning to realize with a cold clarity that felt like standing under a waterfall in January, had never done anything impulsively in her entire life. He had to go back. Even now, even in this hotel suite, his mind went back to a night 4 years into their marriage, when he had come home late and found her at the kitchen table with her Bible open and a legal document beside it, and he had asked carelessly what she was working on. "Just some paperwork," she had said, and she had smiled at him. That particular smile, the one he had always found beautiful without understanding it, and closed the document before he could read the header. He had not asked again. He had not thought to. He had been too absorbed in his own ascent, his regional sales directorship, his growing network, his carefully maintained image as a man on the way up, to consider that the woman sitting quietly at his kitchen table, the woman they all called our wife, with the casual diminishment of people who cannot imagine still water running deep, might be operating in dimensions he had not thought to measure. A wife of noble character, he remembered her reading aloud once, from Proverbs 31, with a quiet joy that he had found mildly amusing. She considers a field and buys it. She sets about her work vigorously. Her trading is profitable. He had smiled and said something patronizing. He could not remember exactly what. He remembered her expression afterward, not hurt, not angry, just patient. The way a woman looks when she has decided that some things are not worth correcting, because time will do it more thoroughly than words. Time had done it this morning. Vanessa stood abruptly. She crossed the suite to the window and stood with her back to him, her arms wrapped around herself. And Raymond watched her and felt for the first time the full architecture of what he had done. Not just to Eleanor, to himself, to the version of his life he had been so certain he was building. "My entire career," Vanessa said quietly. Not to him exactly, to the window, to the city, to the appalling geometry of what she had just learned. Every promotion, every contract I closed, every deal that made my name worth anything in that industry. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass. She could have ended it at any point. "But she didn't," Raymond said. "She didn't." Vanessa turned, and for the first time Raymond saw something in her face that was not performance or ambition or the carefully deployed magnetism that had pulled him away from his marriage. He saw something raw, something that looked uncomfortably like the beginning of understanding. Why didn't she? Raymond had no answer, because to answer that question, He would have had to know Eleanor, truly know her, in a way he was beginning to understand he never had. He drove to the house at 11. He did not call ahead. He told himself it was because he did not know what to say. But the truth he was not yet ready to fully hold, was that he was afraid. For the first time in a marriage that had lasted 7 years, Raymond Hayes was afraid of his wife. He pulled into the driveway of the house that was, he now realized with fresh eyes, registered in Eleanor's name, renovated with Eleanor's funds, maintained with an attention and care that he had absorbed as his due without once asking where it came from. He sat in the car for a long moment. Through the living room window, he could see 2 figures at the kitchen table. Eleanor and his mother. His mother was crying. Raymond had not seen Dorothy Hayes cry since his father's funeral 14 years ago. She was not a woman who permitted public emotion. She considered it, he knew, a form of weakness she could not afford. But she was crying now, quietly, and with her hands folded on the table and her head slightly bowed. And Eleanor was sitting across from her with a glass of water and an expression on her face that Raymond could not read from the driveway, but that struck him, even through glass and distance, as something extraordinary. Eleanor was not comforting his mother the way a wounded woman comforts her tormentor out of social obligation. She was not performing grace. She was simply present, still and solid and real, the way she had always been, the way he had always taken for granted. And something about the quality of that presence made Raymond's chest constrict with a pain he did not have immediate vocabulary for. He got out of the car. He rang the doorbell of a house he had lived in for 6 years, because something in him understood, arriving here this morning, that he had forfeited the right to simply walk in. Eleanor opened the door. She was still in her robe. Her hair was natural, unpinned. The way she wore it on mornings she was not performing anything for anyone. Her face was composed. Her eyes, those eyes he had looked into 7 years ago at an altar and promised things he had not kept, were clear, not cold, not triumphant, not even particularly sad, just clear. "Raymond," she said. "Eleanor." His voice broke slightly on the second syllable. He had not expected that. He stopped. He had rehearsed something in the car. It had evaporated completely. "Gerald Monroe called me." "I know," she said. "You knew this morning. When the lawyer came with the papers, you already knew." "Yes," she said simply. "Why?" He stopped again, swallowed. "Why didn't you tell me? Any of it? About Apex?" About Eleanor. Why didn't you tell me who you were?" And Eleanor Grace Hayes, the woman they had called our wife without her name, the woman they had called Baren without her consent, the woman who had built a $1 trillion empire in the quiet spaces of a marriage that had never fully seen her, looked at her husband of 7 years with an expression that contained, in equal measure, grief and grace and the particular dignity of a woman who has settled every account with God before bringing it to any human courtroom. "Because, Raymond," she said quietly, "I wanted you to love Eleanor, not the company, not the empire." She paused. "But you didn't love Eleanor either. You loved the idea of her, and when the idea disappointed you, you replaced it." She glanced down briefly, just for a moment, at her abdomen, and then back up at his face. Raymond followed her glance, and something shifted in his expression. Something cracked open that had been closed for a very long time. "Eleanor," he whispered, "are you—" "Come inside, Raymond," she said, not warmly, not coldly, with the steady authority of a woman who had decided, before he arrived, exactly how much of herself she was willing to spend on this moment. "There are things you need to know, and then there are decisions you will need to make. And I will tell you right now." She held his gaze with a steadiness that made him feel, for the first time in years, genuinely small. "The decisions you make in the next hour will determine everything that follows." She stepped back from the doorway. Raymond Hayes walked into his wife's house, and for the first time in 7 years, he walked in as a man who did not know what he was walking into, which meant for the first time in 7 years, he was finally paying attention. Raymond was inside. The truth was on the table. 3 lives were growing in the silence between every word. But knowing the truth and responding to it rightly are 2 entirely different things. and Raymond Hayes had a history of choosing what was easy over what was right. Would this moment be different? Would the weight of what Eleanor carried, in her womb, in her company, in her faith, be enough to break through 7 years of a man who had never learned to truly see her? And what had Dorothy said in that kitchen before Raymond arrived that had brought her to tears for the first time in 14 years? And what was Eleanor about to do with all of it that would leave every person in that room changed forever? The kitchen had never been so full of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a room holding more truth than it had ever been asked to contain. Raymond sat at the head of the table where he had eaten 1,000 meals without gratitude. Dorothy sat to his left, her eyes still red, her composure still fractured in ways that made her look, for the first time, like a woman rather than a verdict. And Eleanor sat across from them both, unhurried, unperformed, her hands folded on the table in the particular stillness of a woman who has already settled everything with God and is now simply waiting for the humans to catch up. Raymond had not spoken since he sat down. He was still processing, still moving through the architecture of everything he thought he knew, and finding, in room after room, that the walls were different than he remembered. The foundations were different. The house he thought he had built had been built, it turned out, by someone else entirely, while he was busy admiring his own reflection in the windows. Dorothy broke the silence first. "I need to say something," she said. Her voice was stripped of everything it usually carried. The authority, the social precision, the carefully deployed warmth that functioned more as management than love. What remained was the voice of a woman in her late 60s who had spent decades being certain and had arrived this morning at the devastating discovery that certainty is not the same as truth. She looked at Eleanor, directly, without the sideways quality her gaze had always carried before, the gaze that assessed rather than saw, that measured rather than honored. "And I called you Baren," Dorothy said. "I said it in this kitchen. I said it at Sunday dinners. I said it on the phone to my sisters, to Raymond, to people who had no business hearing it. I dressed it up as concern. I told myself it was about the family legacy, about Raymond's future, about things that mattered." She stopped, her jaw tightened against something rising in her throat. "But the truth I have been sitting with since midnight last night, is that I said it because I never believed you were enough for my son. Not because of your womb, because of who I decided you were the moment I met you." Her voice dropped. "A quiet woman, a praying woman, a woman who didn't fight back." She shook her head slowly. "I mistook your peace for weakness. I mistook your silence for submission. No, and I used both against you." The kitchen was very still. "I was wrong," Dorothy said. 3 words, plain, undecorated, the most honest thing Eleanor had ever heard her say. About all of it, about you, about what strength looks like, about what a woman of God actually is. Her eyes filled. She did not blink the tears back this time. She let them come, slowly, with the dignity of a woman who is crying not for performance, but for penance. "Eleanor, I am so deeply sorry." Eleanor looked at her mother-in-law for a long moment. 7 years of Sunday dinners, 7 years of that particular smile, 7 years of the word Baren dropped into conversations like a stone into still water, rippling outward, reaching Raymond, reaching neighbors, reaching the deep interior places where Eleanor had gone alone to grieve what she could not yet explain and pray for what she could not yet see. She thought of Psalm 56:8. "You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book?" God had kept everyone. Not one had fallen unnoticed. Not one had been wasted. "Dorothy," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, steady, without a tremor of performance. "I forgave you a long time ago." She paused. "Not because what you did wasn't painful. It was. It reached places in me that took years to heal. But I forgave you because I understood, early in my walk with God, that unforgiveness is a prison I build for myself, while the other person walks free." She held Dorothy's gaze. "I was not willing to be imprisoned by what you chose, so I gave it to God. And I kept walking." Dorothy pressed a hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, just once, and then she steadied herself with the effort of a woman who had been strong in all the wrong ways for a very long time and was now learning what real strength required. Raymond had been watching his mother cry, and something about the sight, something about seeing the woman who had always been the immovable architecture of his confidence, sitting broken and honest at Eleanor's kitchen table, reached him in a place that his own guilt had not yet managed to access. Eleanor, his voice was rough, unpolished, the voice of a man without his usual armor. I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that however you answer it, I have no right to, I have no standing to. He stopped. Started again. Ari, are you pregnant? The kitchen held its breath. Eleanor looked at her husband, the man she had loved with her whole heart for 7 years, the man who had spent that love carelessly and then filed the waste as her failure. The man who was sitting at her table right now with something in his face that she had not seen since the early years of their marriage. Not charm, not confidence, not the performance of a man managing his image, but nakedness, true, unmanaged nakedness, a man finally out of costume. She placed her right hand on the table. Then she moved it, slowly, deliberately, to rest flat against her abdomen. Raymond's breath left him. 10 weeks, Eleanor said. And Raymond. She held his eyes with a steadiness that was not cruelty and not mercy, but something more complete than both. It is not one. He stared at her. Shorta triplets, she said simply. The word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped from a great height into deep water. The ripple moved outward, across Raymond's face, across Dorothy's face, across the entire architecture of the morning. And for a long moment, nobody spoke and nobody moved, and the kitchen held 3 people in various stages of understanding what it means to be undone by grace. Raymond put his face in his hands. Not theatrically, not with the performance of a man managing how his remorse appeared. He simply put his face in his hands the way a man does when the full weight of what he has done arrives all at once, and there is no posture adequate to receive it. 3, he said into his palms, muffled, raw. 3, Eleanor confirmed. Dorothy made a sound that was not quite a word, something that came from beneath language. From the place where a grandmother's heart lives before it is filtered through pride and agenda. She reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand with both of hers. And Eleanor, who had every right to withdraw, who had every theological and emotional justification for maintaining distance, turned her hand over and held Dorothy's back. Because this was who Eleanor Grace Hayes was, not in performance, in constitution. But the story was not finished. There was still Vanessa. There was still the divorce petition sitting on the counter. There was still a $1 trillion company with a new executive chairman and a senior vice president whose position was under review. There was still a second marriage, legally executed, publicly announced, that Raymond had entered 3 weeks ago with a woman who had built her career, unknowingly, inside the empire of the woman he had left. Eleanor had thought about all of it. She had prayed about all of it. Long before this morning, long before the divorce papers, in the prayer closet of this house, on her knees with her Bible open and her tears honest and her trust in God absolute. And God had given her clarity, not the clarity of anger, which is easy, not the clarity of revenge, which is satisfying but ultimately empty. The clarity of Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Justice, mercy, humility. All 3, not one instead of another. All 3, together, are held in tension by a woman who believed that God's economy operates differently than the world's, and that the most powerful thing she could do with everything she had been given was not to destroy, but to restore. She had made 3 calls before Raymond arrived. The first call had been to Gerald Monroe. She had instructed him to complete Vanessa Cole's performance review fairly. Based on her actual work, her genuine contributions, the measurable value she had brought to Apex Global independent of any personal entanglement. She had been clear. I will not use my position to punish her professionally for personal reasons. If her work merits her role, she keeps it. If it does not, the review will say so. But it will be fair. Gerald had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, Mrs. Hayes, in 20 years of corporate governance, I have never received an instruction quite like that. Then it's overdue, Eleanor had said, and ended the call. The second call had been to her attorney, Catherine Briggs, a sharp, faith-rooted woman who had been Eleanor's legal counsel for 8 years and who had drafted every holding company document that protected Apex Global's ownership structure. Eleanor had instructed Catherine to respond to the divorce petition, not to fight it on grounds of wealth or power, but to ensure that the legal process accounted for all relevant facts, including the pregnancy, and that whatever outcome followed was built on complete truth rather than the selective narrative Raymond had filed. And Catherine, Eleanor had added, whatever he is entitled to as my spouse under law, I am not interested in punishing him financially. I am interested in what is right. Catherine had said, Eleanor, you are either the most spiritually mature person I have ever represented or the most strategic, possibly both. I'll take both, Eleanor had said, and she had almost smiled. The third call had been the most difficult. She had called Vanessa Cole directly. The phone had rung 4 times. Then Vanessa had answered, her voice careful, braced, the voice of a woman who already knew the call was coming and had spent an hour preparing for it and still did not feel prepared. Mrs. Hayes, Vanessa had said. Ms. Cole, Eleanor had replied, and then, because Eleanor Grace Hayes did not believe in prolonging pain unnecessarily, she had said what she called to say. I know who you are. I know what you built and how you built it. I know what role my company played in your career. And I know what role my husband played in your life. A pause. I called to tell you that I will not weaponize Apex Global against you. Your career will be evaluated on its merit. And I called to tell you one other thing. Eleanor had taken a breath. What was done to my marriage involved 2 people. Raymond made choices. You made choices. But I will not spend what God has given me on destruction. I have made my peace with God about all of it, and I am extending that peace to you, not because you have earned it, but because I am not willing to carry the weight of hatred. It is too heavy, and I have too much to carry that is worth carrying. Vanessa had been silent for a long time. Then she had said, in a voice that sounded like something being set down after being carried too long, I didn't know he was still married to you when we first met. By the time I knew, I had already... She stopped. That's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. Mrs. Hayes, I am sorry. For what it's worth, I am genuinely sorry. It is worth something, Eleanor had said. Take care of yourself, Ms. Cole. She had ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of her kitchen, with her hand on her abdomen and her eyes closed, and she had said, Lord, I trust you with the rest. Now at the kitchen table, with Raymond and Dorothy across from her, Eleanor opened her Bible, the one she kept on the kitchen counter, worn at the spine, marked throughout with dates and notes in her own handwriting. She turned to Isaiah 61, the passage she had read in her prayer closet 3 months ago, when she had first understood that the season of silence was ending and the season of restoration was beginning. She read aloud, quietly, without performance. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, to comfort all who mourn, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. She closed the Bible, looked at Raymond. I am not taking you back today, she said, clearly, without anger. What is broken between us is real, and it will take real time and real work and real repentance. Not the repentance of a man who has lost something valuable and wants it returned, but the repentance of a man who understands what he did and why it was wrong and who is willing to become different. She held his eyes. I do not know if you are that man yet, but I am willing to find out, because these 3 lives, she placed her hand on her abdomen, deserve a father who sees their mother, and I serve a God who restores what the locusts have eaten. Joel 2:25. She did not cite it. She lived it. Raymond lowered his head. When he raised it, his eyes were full, not with the easy emotion of a man performing contrition, but with the harder, slower tears of genuine reckoning. The tears of a man who has looked at himself clearly, possibly for the first time, and found the view unbearable and necessary in equal measure. "I don't deserve," he started. "No," Eleanor said gently. "You don't. Neither do I, from God. But he gives anyway. That's what grace is." She paused. "Don't tell me what you feel right now, Raymond. Feelings in this moment are easy. Show me who you choose to become. That's the only currency I'm accepting." Dorothy, who had been listening with the stillness of a woman being remade in real time, reached across and took her son's hand. And then, with her other hand, she reached toward Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the two hands extended toward her across the table of a kitchen she had built, in a house she owned, carrying 3 lives she had prayed for, with a company that bore the name she had chosen before any of them knew her. She took both hands, and the tears that fell in that kitchen, Raymond's, Dorothy's, and finally, quietly, Eleanor's, were not the same tears. Raymond's were the tears of a man finally broken open enough to be rebuilt. Dorothy's were the tears of a woman who had been wrong for so long that being right felt like starting over. And Eleanor's, the tears she finally allowed, the ones she had earned, the ones God had kept in his bottle and now permitted, were the tears of a woman who had held on long enough to see that God had not wasted a single moment of her suffering. He had been working, in the silence, in the hiding, in the kitchen mornings and the prayer closet nights and the ultrasound room and the boardroom and the holding company documents and the 3 heartbeats growing in the body of a woman they had called Baren. He had been working all along. 6 months later, Eleanor Grace Hayes stood at the window of the executive suite on the 42nd floor of the Apex Global headquarters. The building she had founded, the empire she had built in the quiet of a life that had never looked from the outside like power. She was 35 weeks pregnant, enormous and radiant and entirely unbothered by either adjective. Behind her, Raymond was on a call with the family therapist they had been seeing weekly since that Thursday morning in the kitchen. He was different now. Not perfectly, not completely, not without setbacks and difficult conversations and moments where the old Raymond surfaced and had to be consciously, deliberately set aside. But different in the way that matters, different in his attention, his accountability, his willingness to be wrong and say so and try again. One of the divorce petition had been withdrawn, quietly, by mutual agreement, without drama. Vanessa Cole had left Apex Global voluntarily 3 weeks after Eleanor assumed the chairmanship, not because she was pushed out, but because she had requested a meeting with Eleanor, sat across from her in the same boardroom where Eleanor had once pitched 7 skeptical investors in a borrowed blazer, and said, "I think it's time for me to build something of my own, and I want to thank you for the grace you showed me. I didn't deserve it, but I won't waste it." Eleanor had stood and extended her hand. "Go build something good," she had said, "and build it clean." Dorothy had moved into the guest room for the final trimester. Not permanently, but presently. Because Eleanor's due date was 3 weeks away, and because Dorothy Hayes, while stripped of her armor and her verdicts and her carefully maintained hierarchy, had turned out to be something Eleanor had not expected. A woman who, when she stopped performing strength, was capable of real love. She was in the nursery right now, assembling a crib with the focused determination of a grandmother who intended to be present for every moment she had almost disqualified herself from. Eleanor turned from the window and looked at the room around her, the empire she had built, the title she now wore openly without apology, the name on the door, E.G. Hayes, Executive Chairman, that contained everything she was and nothing she had ever hidden from God, even when she had hidden it from everyone else. Her phone buzzed. A message from her doctor. "Everything looks perfect, Eleanor. 3 strong heartbeats. I see you Thursday." She placed her hand on her abdomen, the same gesture she had made in the kitchen on a Thursday morning that felt like a lifetime ago. And she felt them move, all 3, a shifting, living, unmistakable declaration of everything God had been doing in the silence. "This is what he does," she said quietly, to no one and to God simultaneously. "He takes what they called barren and fills it with more than they could have imagined." She sat at her desk, opened her Bible, the same one, spine more worn now, more pages marked, more dates recorded in her handwriting, alongside the evidence of a faith that had never been theoretical. She turned to the verse she had written in the front cover on the morning she founded Apex Global 12 years ago. Before anyone knew her name or her vision or the depth of what she was capable of. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. Proverbs 31:25. She had laughed then, young and certain and full of a faith that had not yet been tested. She laughed now too, older, tested, broken in places that had healed stronger than they were before, full of a faith that was no longer theoretical, that had been walked through fire and silence and betrayal and the particular cruelty of people who decide you are less than you are, and had emerged not just intact, but enlarged. The crown had always been hers. She had simply been waiting for God's timing to wear it openly. And the God who sees in secret, the God who keeps tears in bottles and counts every prayer and works in all things for the good of those who love him, had not been one moment late. He never is. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. Proverbs 31:25. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Isaiah 41:10. He restores to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten. Joel 2:25. Dear viewers, you just watched a woman who was underestimated, discarded, and declared barren by the very people who should have protected her. And you watched God honor every prayer she prayed in secret in ways that left every person who doubted her in tears. This story teaches you that your silence is not your defeat. Your faithfulness is not your weakness. And what God is building in you cannot be destroyed by what people say about you. The crown was always hers, and yours is coming too. Drop in the comments right now. What lesson touched you deepest? And what would you have done differently in Eleanor's shoes? Subscribe, because more stories like this are waiting for you. God bless you.